Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time you are tuning in. Welcome to Homesteading and Gardening in the Suburbs. I'm Emma from Misfit Gardening, and today I want to talk a little bit about animal-free gardening. Because lots of gardeners, especially organic gardeners, seem to assume that you always need animal manure for gardening. And many of us, certainly those of us that were taught by our grandparents, might have been told you need really good horse muck to be able to grow a good garden, or you need to get some really good farmyard manure to grow a good garden. And it's true, like manures do provide a good source of nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus, but it's not necessary to actually grow a garden with these. You can grow a garden quite well without them. And for many of us, using animal products isn't necessarily something that we want to do. Some people call it vegan gardening. I've heard it called stock-free gardening. I've even heard it called ethical gardening. It's basically gardening without animal products or artificial fertilizers. And as I mentioned, you can't have a garden that's organic without animal manure. I hear it all the time. And I really can't tell you how many times I've heard that. You can absolutely manage the fertility of the soil using cover crops or green manures and compost. And that's compost that was made with vegetative materials, so plant matter, not manure. It's actually quite difficult to find manure from animals that have not been fed on hay that's been treated with herbicides, right? If you're looking for horse manure and stuff, it's kind of difficult. Like, I've asked so many people in my life gardening, like, hey, was no pun intended there, but was the hay that you fed the horses, was that treated with pesticides? Usually the phrase was, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. And more often than not, I would find that it had been, and you could kind of tell after sort of a couple of weeks of using the stuff, your plants would be kind of having a hard time of it. Now, it could be if you're using like fresh manure, it's having a hard time because it's what's known as hot. There's a lot of nitrogen in there, and that kind of has an adverse effect on the plants growing. But sometimes it can be because of the broadleaf pesticides, not fertilizers, broadleaf pesticides that are being used to kill off weeds, which are broadleaves. Well, guess what your vegetables are? They're mostly a broadleaf plant, and they're going to be susceptible to these types of pesticides. So usually herbicides that are being used are a broadleaf. They're not really discriminate on what they're going to be killing off. It's pretty much anything that is a broadleaf in the garden. So that's why you have to be careful if you're using herbicides in the garden to keep them away from the plants that you like, because it's going to kill those too. Another reason why people often try to avoid using animal products and manures in the garden is because they're trying to avoid animals that have been treated with antibiotics at some point, and that's even harder than trying to find out if an animal has been fed stuff that was treated with a pesticide. Antibiotics might be an unusual one, but essentially an antibiotic is designed to kill certain types of bacteria, and that can pass through the animal and it can impact the soil bacteria in the garden. So a lot of people want to be sure that those do not end up in their garden, and that would mean that animal manures are something that they would want to avoid, or raise the animals themselves and make sure they haven't been treated if that's what they want to do and what they're able to do. Obviously, depending on where you are and what you're raising the animals for, there is rules and regulations as to what you have to treat them with. So, obviously I'm all about following the rules here. I'm a rule follower. But if you're wanting to have that level of control for your garden and what's going into your garden and your animals, then you're obviously going to want to be rearing them yourself, because oh, this animal was sick, or this had to have this administered, and it was administered, however many weeks ago, and you're able to keep track of all that so much better than, sort of popping over to the local stable or the local farm saying, hey, can I have some manure from you for my garden? So there's that aspect of it. And of course, there's also an environmental impact of animals from additional plantings of feed producing crops. There's also the carbon footprint associated with growing those, harvesting them, processing them and shipping them, supplementing the animals with vitamins and minerals and all that good stuff that goes into raising animals. And that's sometimes another reason why gardeners are opting for an animal-free or an animal product-free approach to gardening. So let's talk a bit about how to garden without animal products, because it does offer a couple of advantages. It's a low-cost gardening method, right? You're using what you have already on your homestead and in your garden. You're not having to, run down to the farm or have things delivered for you, right? You can have, manure and things often delivered to you, or, drive over to the local stables and pick it all up and stuff. There's an element of, reducing the time because you're not having to do that, as well as the carbon emissions from driving around and all that good stuff. So you don't have any of that, as well as none of the stuff that went into the animals being able to poop. So, none of that feed production, all that sort of stuff. So the first thing, as with any garden, is you want to be building up soil fertility, and it's the same for a animal product free garden. You want to be using garden compost that's made from plants, right? You want to be using green manures or cover crops to help add fertility to the soil, and you want to use resources already in the garden, and adding that organic matter to the soil is going to help bring in more earthworms. It's going to help retain water, it's going to help retain nutrients in the soil and help that underground ecological web of soil life grow. And that's what we want, because it's those workhorses that are living in the soil that are going to help our plants and garden thrive. Now, compost itself helps to replenish nitrogen, and that's what helps plants grow lush and green. It also helps to replenish phosphorus and potassium in the soil. Both are needed for flower production, strong healthy roots, and the ability to grow vigorously and, help kind of, live with the various stresses and strains that a plant has to deal with, from pests, diseases, climate, different changes in the weather, heat, cold, all that good stuff, right? Now, generally speaking, compost that contains more kitchen waste is going to be higher in nitrogen than compost made from woody materials like hardwood sawdust and wood shavings from your husband's workshop, for example, that you may have had your eye on and are planning on putting into the compost bin as soon as you can find where the compost bin has disappeared under the snow. But also, if you've got compost that's been made from a lot of shrub prunings that you've chipped, over fall, for example, you're going to have, a lot less nitrogen in there than you are from something that is primarily kitchen scraps, right? Things that are fruit and veggie peelings and stuff coming out of the kitchen. You really want a good mix of woody materials, fall leaves, kitchen scraps, like those peelings and offcuts and stuff like that. You want those kind of mixed together for your compost, really, because that's going to give you a good mix of nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. And those are the three big ones that plants need to grow, as well as other trace minerals and elements that your plants are going to need. And that's always the best thing, right? Have a good mix of things that are in your compost, right? So you're going to be able to give back to your garden a good mix of things. Now, you can also grow nitrogen fixing plants, things like vetch, trefoil, clover, beans and peas, right? Legumes. They take nitrogen from the air and they help bring that to the soil where bacteria can help make it available for plants to use. There's lots of different nitrogen fixing plants that are available. You can get them as like a single plant. You can get them as a nitrogen fixing mix. You can get soil building mixes of green manures and cover crops from a seed supply, which makes it really easy to be able to use these in the garden. Now you might be thinking, Emma, what is a green manure? I did a whole podcast about green manures and a blog post as part of an intensive gardening series that I did, like a training series. So if you're new and you haven't seen that, then I'll put a link to the blog post, because that's probably going to be the easiest way for you to find all the posts in that series. So you can check those out and you can see the podcasts that go with those. But basically, a green manure is a plant that is grown. It's then cut, dug in, or turned over into the soil, and as that plant decomposes, it adds fertility into the soil so your plants can use that to grow. Green manures need planning into your garden to get the most nutrients for your early spring plants, so you do need to take a little bit of time to kind of map out how you're going to use them and when you would be sowing them, when you would then be turning them under into the soil, and when you would be needing to put your transplants out into that soil in your garden bed, So they do need a little bit of planning to be able to get the most from it, but they offer some really good advantages, right? They cover the soil, they protect it from being washed away by rain or melting snow. They help keep the soil shaded in summer if you're not using that garden bed. They provide an ideal habitat for not just nature's plows, as Charles Darwin put it, which is the humble yet mighty earthworm, but they can also provide, food and habitat sources for beneficial insects, especially if you're growing things like clovers or vetch, things that produce flowers. They're going to produce a source of food for bees and other pollinators to come into the garden. So having green manures, and you don't have to go all out and I'm going to do green manures on all of these garden beds and I'm going to plant all this in. Like, if you've never used green manures before, like, don't think that you've got to do it for the entire garden. You can just start with one garden bed. Like, hey, I'm going to put green manures in this bed first. I'm going to let them grow a little bit, and then I'm going to turn them under, and by the time that they've been turned under, the frosts and stuff should have gone, and I should be okay to plant out melons, for example. Just as an example, right? You don't need to try and figure out, okay, I've got these 14 beds and I've got to do this, and then I want to put, like, I don't know, the vetch in this one and the clover in this one, and I'm gonna do winter rye in this one. Like, don't make it complicated. If this is your first time doing it, try just a basic seed, soil building mix, and, try it in 1 or 2 beds and then build from there, right? Gardening is a skill that we want to build on, and just try slow and, take lots of notes, like what worked, what didn't, right? I'm a big advocate of reflecting back on what worked in your garden. I'm having to try and figure out what worked in my garden like 10 years ago, because I've changed different climates, and I'm trying to figure out what is going to be growing best out here. I've been talking to other gardeners, and I've been figuring out that, blight is a problem for a lot of gardeners where I'm at. So now I'm having to try and remember, how did I grow tomatoes when I was in the UK? Greenhouse. That's how I grew them. So, take some time to chat with other gardeners and figure out what, some of the common issues are for your garden, and, think of ways that you can, help build your soil and improve your plant's chances at being able to combat some of these problems by using, techniques that are not using, animal products, basically. Another thing that people do for this kind of animal product free gardening is they grow their own fertilizers. And many animal-free gardeners grow a couple of patches of plants that are specifically for making liquid plant feeds. Comfrey and stinging nettle are both very popular. Certainly very popular on many an allotment in the UK. Comfrey is incredibly popular within the permaculture community. It's definitely the poster child plant for a permaculture garden is comfrey. Both are great. Obviously, comfrey isn't as stingy as a stinging nettle, which people can have various allergic reactions to. But comfrey, it's kind of spiky after a while, and if you are really kind of handling a lot of it, you can end up with some sensitivity, so wear gloves if you're going to be handling either of those. But liquid plant feeds are basically made by either putting several handfuls of weeds or the comfrey and stinging nettle, either separately or together, like in a bucket, cover that with water, leave it there for a week or so, and then it creates this stinky mess that the plants absolutely love. Alternatively, you can fill a bucket with leaves and clippings of comfrey or stinging nettle, and then compress everything down with a heavy object like a couple of bricks or something, and that squeezes the liquid out, so you're going to make a more concentrated liquid at the bottom of that bucket. It is a slightly less stinky plant feed. And you can dilute that down with water, use that to, water your plants, and, it provides an extra nutrition boost. And once done, those plant residues can go straight into the compost, right? So everything's kind of getting recycled, reused, and it's going back into the garden, which is what we want anyway, right? We want to be replenishing those nutrients that are lost, because as we're harvesting our plants, we're taking nutrients out. So if we just left the plants in place, right, they would eventually die off with the winter, they'd break down, and all those nutrients that were being taken up by the plant, they would be going back into the soil. But because we harvest things and take them away from the garden, we're always taking away nutrients from the garden. So we want to be making sure that we're putting that back in and replenishing it. Now, crop rotation is often overlooked when gardening, but it's actually quite important. It not only reduces diseases that are in the soil, but it also helps to balance soil fertility. And you can grow crops that need a lot of nutrients. They're also known as hungry crops. They're things like potatoes, tomatoes, corn, cabbage, collards, kale, actually any of the brassicas, things like squash and pumpkins, right? You can grow those after you've grown beans or peas in that space, or after you've had green manures that have been turned under, because those are crops that need a lot of nutrients to grow, right? And to be able to grow well. And then after you've grown those hungrier crops, you could plant things that don't use as much nutrients. So things like salads or root vegetables like onions, beets, turnips, or carrots and parsnips, right? And then you can follow that up again by growing beans, peas, or green manures again, right? You want to be regularly adding additions of compost anyway throughout, the growing, just because it helps to keep that organic matter levels, at a higher level. That helps make a nice home for things like soil microbes, earthworms, and all of those amazing creatures that help your garden flourish. So, take some time to figure out how you can rotate your crops over the next couple of years in your garden to be able to grow more from your garden and reduce pests and diseases, because that's a really big thing for crop rotation. Is you're moving away from, I've had tomatoes growing in this spot for a while, I probably shouldn't grow anything else in the nightshade family there, which would mean potatoes, eggplant, chili peppers, those kind of things. You don't want to be growing those in the same place consistently, because the pests that readily attack those plants are going to start to keep coming and building in numbers, and then you'll start to have problems with pests and diseases attacking your plants. So crop rotation is good to kind of provide a break, so you're going to keep those numbers of diseases and pests and things much lower than you were if you keep growing in that same space. So, even, farmers that are working on much bigger scales, they're rotating their crops to reduce soil-borne pests and diseases. So it's a good practice to have, and almost all organic gardens do this sort of crop rotation. So see how you can do it and how you can work in green manures to yours. But I would love to know from you, what's your favorite gardening tip to grow without using animal manures or animal products? Or even if you use manure in your garden, like, do you use manure in the garden? Why do you use manure in the garden? Would you consider switching? I would love to know. Let me know over in the Facebook group. Until next time, I hope your garden grows beautifully, and I will see you all next week.